Hello. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting here today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Hilary Searing. I'm a partner in our Workplace Relations, Employment and Safety team here at Clayton Utz. And with me I have Shae McCartney, who's the head of our National Safety Practice. And what we're here to talk about today is psychosocial hazards. This is really a key trend and an emerging risk area that we are seeing more and more of. Our clients, this is something our clients are asking us about constantly now. But Shae, there's a lot of talk about psychosocial hazards and a lot of talk about this sort of emerging risk area, but what does it actually mean?
Yeah, Hill, it's a terrible name, isn't it? Psychosocial hazards, and especially if you have a bit of a lisp, it's very difficult to say. But I think what people need to understand is it's really just how can your workplace harm the mental health of its workers. So it's not necessarily about how workers might have mental health issues, although of course that's part of the matrix that you have to take into account, because if people have specific vulnerabilities, they might be more susceptible to injury from the workplace environment they're in. But really the focus has to be on how does your work or how does your business actually harm the mental health of the workers, and therefore what controls can you put in place to protect it. And there are a lot of examples, and we'll talk a little bit later about codes of practice, etc. But some of the things are quite obvious. So bullying and harassment, sexual harassment, workplace interactions that are abusive or obviously could
damaging,
cause harm to workers. But there are other aspects about work that can harm workers as well, and that the focus hasn't been as clearly on and perhaps needs to be more on. So that's things like job design, overwork, underwork, high pressure, people not fit for the job. So for example, you've got a CEO, they're perhaps been a CEO in multiple big companies. They might have a very stressful job, they might have very high pressure, have to work long hours and make a lot of decisions, but they are skilled and tooled to do that. If you put another person who perhaps hadn't had that experience into that same job, knowing that they weren't fit to do that role, well then that might be causing them harm. So it does require companies to think about it, I guess, a bit more broadly than perhaps they have been. Hilary, and when we look at how people are finding it hard, is that surprising given how differently the states have approached it?
Well, yes, Shae, I think we talked about it being an emerging risk area, and we talked about potentially sort of clients calling us and asking us about this a lot. And the reason why I think people are finding it hard and are struggling with it is that when they did the review of the work health and safety legislation, which Marie Boland did, she identified that companies and organisations didn't really appreciate and understand that this was an area that they actually needed to manage, and that typically companies and organisations have focused on managing of physical hazards, physical risks, and I think we're all very used to controlling those, to managing those. If someone breaks their leg, they've tripped over something, you can see a trip hazard. We know how to assess that risk, how to control that risk, how to manage that risk. But the psychological aspects, the psychosocial hazards, business organisations haven't readily understood that they're actually also meant to be managing that. And so what we have seen the states and the territories and the organisation, Commonwealth do, is to say this is actually an area that needs to be reminded, that needs to be reiterated to organisations, and so they've actually now introduced legislation specifically to deal with this. So into the various, the harmonised legislation, and then into various acts in the states and territories, they've now introduced a new positive duty to manage psychosocial hazards. So it's now embedded into, so far we have it in the Commonwealth, we have it in Queensland, New South Wales, WA and Tasmania, Victoria and the ACT have drafts, and South Australia and the Northern Territory are talking about updates to their regulations. And the reason why I think people are finding that a little bit difficult is because safety, we do have harmonised legislation at the sort of federal level, but each state and territory has to actually incorporate those laws into their own jurisdiction for them to apply. So if it applies in Queensland, we actually have to adopt that and put it into our own Queensland state law, for example.
And Hilary, because this is being dealt with in the regulations, and obviously there's a code of practice as well, some of the states are dealing with it differently to others.
I think organisations are going to struggle with these differences because For example, in the Commonwealth legislation that's just been introduced, in the Queensland legislation that's coming in, they are requiring organisations to actually manage this in accordance with the hierarchy of controls, and we'll talk a bit more about what that means in a moment. But in other states and territories, you don't. Marie Boland's view was that the hierarchy of controls, it was very difficult to manage psychosocial hazards by implementing the hierarchy of controls, because it was very difficult to design out, in her view, a hazard. And so
do we want to just stop there for a second and actually explain what the hierarchy of controls are, because some viewers might not understand them. But so the hierarchy of controls, if you don't do a lot of safety work, is where you look to the highest order control first. So the thing that is most likely to remove the risk, preferably entirely, so eliminate the risk. And then if you can't eliminate the risk, to then minimise it using the things that are going to be the most effective. And so to give you an example, to eliminate a psychosocial hazard, really the only way, and I think this is what Marie Boland was talking about, it's the only way to do that is to effectively have robots do the work where there are no workers involved and therefore no mental health is at risk of injury.
Like a self-service thing where you eliminate customers altogether, something like that.
And I'm a little bit worried, if you want to look at some of our AI videos, that might be the case for lawyers too shortly, but you know, that's for another day, or for another video at least. So then if you can't eliminate the risk, you have to minimise it. The first order is to substitute it, to substitute the hazard with something else. Now, that's a bit hard in a psychosocial sense, and again, I think this is where Marie Boland was coming from. But I guess the type of thing you might be thinking about there is that if you have a very prescriptive role that has little control and that creates a risk to someone's mental health, well, you might substitute that work with a more flexible work environment. So it's a bit of a stretch, but you know, that's I guess an example. The next level control is to isolate the risk. So that's very easy in a physical sense. That's putting a guard around something, you know, protecting.
Might be able to put a barrier up to block people from aggressive customers, for example, or give them a safe place to retreat to.
Yeah, exactly. And so again, in a psychosocial sense, you might be, for example, if you have knowledge that someone has committed sexual harassment or bullying and harassment type behaviours, you might remove them from the workplace, either remove them from the unhelpful or harmful interactions, or perhaps even to fire them. That will isolate them from
eliminate the risk.
Yeah. And then the one that I think is probably the most effective, and the one that perhaps businesses are not using nearly enough, and that really this is, I think, where Queensland's saying you need to be looking at higher order controls, is the engineering or designing out the risk. And that's the one where I think there are a lot of wins and gains for employers to get, particularly, and we'll come to talking about working from home in a moment, but where we really have the opportunity to redesign the workplace. So there are new hazards. We need to start thinking about how we design our work to be protective and not to cause harm. And then the final one, and the hierarchy of controls actually says that you can only look at administrative controls. So the final one is administrative controls. And you are only actually able to look at administrative controls when you have gone through, in that order, the rest of the controls. And that's where I think we have a lot of issues with psychosocial risks and the management of them, because it's really easy to go to the administrative controls.
That's right, Shae, and I think that is an area that a lot of organisations have been relying on in the past. So sort of building individual resilience, for example, through wellness programs and the like. But what the...
And EAP providers.
Correct. But that really focuses on the outcome, if you like, or the result, rather than actually eliminating or minimising the risk of the hazard that might be causing the need for that person to have that resilience, or those EAP providers. And I think that when the Queensland government was introducing the new code, they were talking about building organisational resilience rather than looking at the individual level. And I think that's really that systems design is going to become critical about how do we look at that, how do we design our works and our processes to provide that physically and psychologically safe workplace.
And Hilary, can we talk a minute about working from home? Because I think that is where some of these challenges have become even harder. Why is that so difficult to manage the working from home risks?
Well, I was just thinking about this when we were preparing for this presentation, Shae, and I think about where we were 2-3 years ago. The sort of standard 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, was almost the absolute norm, with some people having individual flexibility agreements or flexibility built into their workplace, but it was really not the norm. But now, when you look at we've had an incredible shift in, I think, a very short space of time with COVID, and I cannot imagine that we would be able to that any workplace is going to go back to saying, okay, sorry, everyone is going to be.
Sad as that might make some of us.
That you have to be in the office from 9 until 5. This is your prescriptive lunchtime. Of course, there might be some roles where that's absolutely required, but generally, for most of our clients, for most of our workplaces in Australia, you're going to have this now almost an expectation of flexibility. But I feel like that's almost something that organisations have stumbled into along the way because of it. First, of course, the directives from COVID that made everybody have to work from home at very short notice, sometimes for very lengthy periods, and then otherwise, organisations appropriately trying to address the risks in the workplace. So I feel like it's almost something that's kind of organically happened, but without a lot of care and thought and consideration given to, well, where are we now? Where does that move us moving forward? Is this where we want to be? And do we need to be putting some more structures around it to help manage? Because I think the risks of having people working from home is very different to being in the office, and particularly from a psychosocial perspective. I think that the literature is telling us that working from home increases your psychosocial risks of social isolation, quantitative demands, bullying and harassment, and actually worker-family conflict. So, these are things I think that organisations haven't really turned their mind to or typically thought about. Shae, what do you think?
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I think it's also, so the risks have changed, but also our ability to control the risks or to implement controls has changed. So it's very hard to go into a worker's home, or even to know what that home environment looks like, or to ask questions about what might be the psychological hazards in that workplace. So we're very good at, and most of our clients have checklists that do ergonomic assessments to make sure that their home setup, has the right ergonomic environment. But it's much harder to say, is working from home actually putting you at risk from a domestic violence situation, or what filters do you have to make sure that you shut down the computer at a certain time and you're not continually coming back? In some,
when are you working? When are you at home?
Yep. Some countries have actually implemented a mandatory, internet shutdown, to control that time spent at work. And, we can get onto working hours in another exciting video. But it has the same implications from psychological health and safety. If you're always on call, when do you actually shut down and build that resilience? And it is much harder to control, much harder to think about how we implement that hierarchy of controls, which is why a lot of employers have reverted back to wellness programs, and perhaps why a lot of managers have stepped away from managing risk. Have you seen that in terms of the sort of lack of managerial skill set?
Yeah, Shae, I think there's been a recent study, I think it was done by the Edith Cowan University, which says that what they're finding is that WHS managers and managers more generally, not just WHS managers, are tapping out, according to this research, on managing psychosocial risks, because sometimes they think this is an HR issue or an employment issue that should be dealt with in a completely separate way or a separate department, but also because I think it's getting too hard. How do we actually, and particularly in the work from home context.
And I think they're scared of the claims against them as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you.
No, that's fine.
But I think that they're scared of the bullying and harassment claims, and so they step back, as you say, tap out. And we know that really one of the most protective measures that we can have for the psychological health and safety of our workers is strong managers who provide them support, who are the first line to identify when there are issues, to identify new hazards, to do the risk assessment, to identify what controls are not working and how to implement new controls. So if our managers are not managing, we really haven't got a hope, no matter how many good wellness programs we might have in place.
And they keep talking about the importance of building that strong safety culture. I think if people aren't managing it and they aren't doing that, it's almost impossible to build a strong safety culture.
Hilary, the regulators are also having to come to terms with new legislation and perhaps a new focus, I know, for 20 years now, it's very rare to have a regulator. While it's always been that you have to manage the health and safety, which includes physical and mental health, it has been very rare for a regulator to become involved in, mental health issues, if you like, or injuries that might occur. So WorkCover will become involved, but not the regulator. That's obviously changed with the new legislation. Has the regulator changed? How are they coping with it?
Yeah, I think you're right, Shae. We have seen a real change in focus. We've seen a real emphasis from the regulators on now taking this on board, realising it's this new risk area that they need to manage, and becoming much more proactive in this space. So the New South Wales safety regulator, SafeWork New South Wales, recently issued its priority program and focus areas for the next 6 months. Key on that for the resources regulator in New South Wales was reviewing risk assessments of clients in this space on how they are dealing with the psychosocial hazards, and are they implementing the risk assessments and the control measures that their code of practice has recommended. I also know that they have, the regulators across the country have been putting a lot of increased funding and effort into upskilling their investigators and their inspectors in psychological safety, to the extent of bringing in organisational psychologists and training their people around how to deal with what for them is also a new and difficult area that they're going to have to help business and organisations deal with, but also regulate and potentially prosecute. I'm also seeing, Shae, and I'm sure you are too, a lot of complaints that formerly would have gone to WorkCover or to the Fair Work Commission, bullying and harassment, and people are now going to the safety regulator, and we are receiving, our clients are receiving, and we are helping them deal with things like notices to produce information on effectively how have you managed a bullying and harassment claim, how have you dealt with this situation, and they are very difficult notices to make sure, it's an offence not to give everything, it's an offence not to comply, they're very prescriptive. Our clients are having to effectively go back and say, well, I actually managed this investigation properly, I managed this result properly, because someone's now complained to a safety regulator as opposed to a more, what we would have seen in the past, potentially a different regulator.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any prosecutions to date, but I certainly have seen a significant increase in notices to produce, and they are difficult to comply with because they go back often, as these types of issues often go back over a history of time, so do the notices. I'm also aware of the regulator quite actively using the improvement notices and requiring, so far, organisations to conduct a documented risk assessment. And if you haven't done a documented risk assessment on the psychosocial hazards, you need to. That's fundamental. And then also issuing improvement notices to say that they should then comply and implement with the risk assessment and the controls that have been identified there. So I think they are very actively using their powers, although I haven't seen any prosecutions yet.
So on that prosecution front, Shae, here, where do you think this worst case scenario for a breach of a psychosocial hazards could be? I mean, are we talking a category 1 offence here? Where could this go if you get it really wrong as an organisation?
It is hard to say because obviously when there is harm from a psychological perspective, there are often more than one factor, and so evidentiary issues become very difficult. When the Minister introduced the Victorian industrial manslaughter legislation, she made very clear that her view was that if a worker committed suicide and the employer had, because of a bullying and harassment scenario, and the employer had been on notice of that bullying and harassment and hadn't done anything about it, her view was that the employer could be prosecuted for manslaughter. Now, there's a lot of very difficult tests in a manslaughter case, but I think there is the potential for a fatality to result in a Category 1 offence if the evidence is there. And I guess obviously implementing the controls, creating a safe and healthy workplace, it has so many more values than just protecting yourself from prosecution. But I guess the documentation of it is where you will actually protect yourself from prosecution. So, I don't think we can reiterate enough the need to not just document your health and safety management system, but exactly as you say, when you're investigating a bullying and harassment issue, documenting the supportive measures, the trauma-informed process that you conducted, documenting that every complaint has been closed out and dealt with. These are the things that will make a real difference in a prosecutorial sense.
And Shae, just to wrap up on that, you've talked about the risk assessments and how that helps organisations. What are some of the biggest things we can look at? What are the things that our clients can do to help manage some of these issues?
Yeah, so we've spoken about risk assessments, and anyone who's listened to Hilary and I's podcast will know that if you haven't done a risk assessment on each of your hazards, we'll be coming to visit your home and ask you to explain why. But I guess other than conducting the risk assessment, which is just fundamental, a documented, comprehensive risk assessment, I think the other real key that people need to think about is that it really is time to look at workplace design again. In the 80s, it was all very popular, yes. Workplace design and workflow planning, and it sort of fell out of favour a bit. But we have fundamentally changed the way we work. We're not an employer with a directive employment relationship. We're not a bricks and mortar. People don't all go to the factory, do their job, check in, check out, as we said. And that requires us to actually look at fundamentally, what work are we asking them to do? Can it be done in a 9-to-5 situation? What flexibility works for the employer and the employee in a way that will, not create additional harm? And I think that, that actually requires organisations to do a fair bit of inward looking.
No, I absolutely agree, Shae, and I was just going to add to that to say that organisations should really take a systematic approach to this. They should take a systematic approach and a strong, hard look at what are we doing by way of flexibility, what are we doing by way of working from home, how does that actually fit in with this new emerging risk area of psychosocial hazards, and how are we managing that, and does that work for our work in our workplace or our work in our traditional office and our work at home, because they're all considered a workplace from a health and safety perspective. And I think there are some real steps that could be taken from a design perspective, from a systems perspective, that could help manage a lot of these issues.
And I think you're right in terms of the systematic nature. We've had the Respect at Work, we've had the legislation change with respect to that. So a lot of organisations are looking at, for example, their sexual harassment policies and their complaints procedures, but that has to be looked at as part of the holistic review of psychosocial hazards. It's a really important part, but it's one part of it.
Yeah, and I think it's important because sexual harassment is a psychosocial hazard.
Exactly.
So, you have all of your Respect at Work obligations and your other obligations, but you'll also have to manage it from a, WHS psychosocial hazard perspective as well. So I think that's something worth remembering. Thank you very much for your time today, Shae.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Hilary.